cover exactly what reserve studies are, how they are facilitated, and then when you receive it, how to interpret it and read it. So what are reserves? Ideally, in your operating budget, there will be a line item for a reserve contribution. So your operating budget covers all of your routine operating expenses. So from management fees to insurance to possibly landscaping, a variety of things that the association needs to operate annually. And then that reserve contribution is essentially like a savings account. So those are funds that are separated, they're kept in separate accounts from the operating funds for capital repair and replacement of those common elements. So as you know, the association or cooperative is really only focused on the common components, and the reserves is looking at the long-term big capital repairs for those components. So using the example of a pool, you probably have quite a bit of annual operating expenses associated with that pool, maintenance fees, cleaning fees, if you have lifeguards, lifeguarding, but then there would be some capital components associated with that as well. So this is really the long-term bigger projects that if you had to fund for in any given year would really drastically impact the budget. So the goal is to put funds away periodically every year to stabilize the budget so you can pull from that reserve account when you need to fund for those big ticket projects. So how do we as reserve specialists determine what is association maintained? Well, really, we work with management and the board to make sure that we understand those responsibilities. Usually, people that prepare reserve studies have more of an engineering background, not a legal background. So we're happy to review the governing documents, but if they aren't crystal clear, which we all know, unfortunately, that's more often the case, we do recommend getting a legal opinion of your documents. Attorneys can put together these really nice maintenance responsibility charts that are really useful for management, for the board, current owners, future owners. Us as reserve specialists, a really great tool. But we will work with you to understand how you've interpreted those documents to make sure we understand what is commonly maintained. And then we'll also want to discuss historical practice. So it might be a condominium where the facade is maintained by the association and the windows and doors are maintained by the homeowners. The windows, the sealants around the windows, that might be considered more part of the facade. So even though it's at the window, historically, the associations maintain that as part of the facade. Those are those sort of things that would just want to understand historical practice and how you've operated and what we should include in that reserve study. So when we talk about common, sometimes you might hear the term general common or limited common elements. General common is a common element that the association is responsible for, essentially that everyone has access and utilizes, where a limited common element is typically still common where the association maintains it, but the use is limited to one or more, but less than all units. And so a way I like to think of that is, or a typical example might be a balcony, where it might be commonly maintained, but the use is limited to that individual unit owner that has access to the balcony, not to everyone. If it is a common component, whether it's general or limited, it should be considered for the reserve study. And again, we'll review those legal documents and have work with you to understand what truly is commonly maintained and what the association is responsible for. So what is a reserve study? Well, that's essentially the study that will help determine how much you should contribute to that reserve account. So CAI, or Community Associations Institute, they have reserve study standards. So reserve studies should be prepared in accordance with their standards. They have a 4-part test. They've just recently revised it to a 3-part test, but it covers the same thing. They just kind of combine 2 and 3. So essentially, it has to be the association's responsibility, similar to how you're concerned only with common elements. The reserve study should only be focused on those common elements. It has to have a limited and predictable remaining life. And what we mean here is essentially it has to be something that we can predict will happen. So, for example, when we had the earthquake years ago in DC, there were clients that wanted to start having an insurance deductible for an earthquake and say, well, there might be an earthquake every 5 years or every 10 years. Let's show our insurance deductible in the reserve study as an expense. That's not something that we can readily predict. We certainly don't want to underfund. We want to ensure that you have all the funds available for the capital projects that you're going to need to do. But we don't want to overfund it with these what if type scenarios. That's something that may or may not happen, right? So it has to be something that we can readily predict. And then it has to have a limited useful life. And what that really means is that we have to predict that it'll happen over the duration of the reserve study, which typically is 30 years. So another example for this might be if it's a brand new mid-rise building that has common plumbing. That's something that would be considered typically long-lived when it's brand new, meaning the piping is going to last beyond the duration of the study, which is 30 years. So we wouldn't anticipate needing to replace piping typically over 30 years. So we would exclude that expense and those reserve contributions because we don't anticipate needing to do it anytime soon. Now, as that building ages, piping will get worked into the reserve study. So if you're in a condominium with common plumbing that was built in the 80s, for example, we will have plumbing included as a reserve expense in your study because it's now in that 30-year window. We know that you're going to need to replace your piping, your plumbing within the 30 years, and it falls into the reserve study, so it would be a reserve expense. If you have a pool, example here would be certainly are going to be reserve expenses, right? You're going to have to replaster the pool, perform deck repairs. There's going to be mechanical equipment that has to be replaced, probably a perimeter fence to enclose the pool, furniture. So a lot of expenses associated with that pool. But the pool structure itself typically lasts beyond 30 years. So a brand new community, again, that pool structure will not be included as a line item or as a component in the study. Again, a lot of reserve expenses associated with maintaining that pool, but not that full pool replacement. Now, as the community ages, that pool structure will work into the reserve study similar to the piping and the plumbing. So it really is focused on a 30-year horizon, any expenses that we anticipate during that time period. And then lastly, it has to be above a minimum threshold. And what we mean here is the operating budget should have some funds available for routine, smaller operational type expenses. And the reserve fund really is reserved for these bigger ticket items or components. So a general rule of thumb that we use is about 1% of the budget. So if you have a $200,000 budget, we would set your cutoff or your minimum threshold at $2,000, meaning any expenses below $2,000, probably general maintenance and operating. Any expenses above it qualify as a reserve expense. Now, this is something we'd work with you as we're preparing the reserve study to understand. Some associations already have a reserve threshold or cutoff, so you'd relay that to your reserve specialist and they can set the study up accordingly. If you don't have one, again, no problem. This is something that we would typically provide, and then we would classify all of the components that we're seeing as general maintenance and saying, yes, you're responsible for this. However, it's a general maintenance expense, not a reserve expense.
Michelle, quick question since you brought up brand new construction. Can you give a little bit of time to difference between transition study and reserve study, and then also developers reserve estimate versus an actual reserve study, if you don't mind?
No problem. So developer reserve studies or reserve studies from plans are something that we're starting to see more commonly happen. So there's different levels of a reserve study. A level 1 is a full reserve study with a site inspection. So a community already exists performing that site inspection of reserve study from scratch. A level 2 update is when you've had a reserve study, it's updating that current reserve study with a site inspection, but reusing that inventory and the quantification. A level 3 reserve study is a reserve study, more of a conference call. It's a non-site update where we would just discuss, kind of tweak minor things kind of between those bigger reserve studies, those bigger updates. And then they recently added a level 4 reserve study, which is from plans. Historically, unfortunately, developers would really minimize that reserve contribution to help kind of keep the dues down, help sell units. Then associations would have reserve studies done once when it's transitioned from developer control to board control to kind of get the reserves back on track. But luckily, the practice is starting to change now where developers sometimes are doing reserve studies and actually preparing them from plans. So all the quantities are taken right from the construction plans, and a reserve contribution is put into the budget from those plans to ideally get the budget and the dues off on the right track initially. And then once when it is actually built, then an engineer comes out, performs that level 1 reserve study to really put eyes on everything. Was everything constructed with how the plans were prepared? And kind of, it's more of that full reserve study now that it's been built. So that does vary. Not all developers do that reserve study from plans, but it is becoming more commonplace. It is absolutely best practice to have a reserve study conducted once when the community is constructed to get that level 1 full reserve study. In Virginia, you are required to have a reserve study conducted every 5 years. In Maryland, also required to have a reserve study every 5 years. There is now a legal requirement that the developer has to prepare a reserve study prior to transition. So any developing community that is turning over from developer control to board control, they should be provided a reserve study that the developer has completed. It has to be done pretty close to turnover. So usually that reserve study, more often than not, should include a site inspection, but it might be from plans. But regardless, it is something that the developer should provide. DC does not have a requirement for reserve studies. They're not legally required, whether it's at transition or for existing communities, but it is certainly a best practice. Now, a transition study is intended to help associations understand if they have any defects when it is transitioning from developer control to board control. So ideally, when a new community is built and the construction is kind of turned over, so all of the common elements are now turned over, it's going from developer control to homeowner board control. Everything should be turned over in good condition relative to the age of the community. So I was on the phone with a client earlier, and they actually had a pretty long turnover. So they were under developer control for 15 years. And they're starting to see areas of concern with their docks. Their docks are starting to show, their wood docks are starting to show some failure. But I explained that it's a 15-year-old community. You'd expect that relative to the age, right? But for a brand new community, was built last year, you would expect that wood dock to be in really good condition. So what a transition study does, or a defect study does, is looks at all of the components relative to their age and puts together a report or kind of punch list of concerns so that the board can go to the developer and say, hey, before we accept ownership of the community or as part of the negotiations for ownership, we want these items fixed because these are not in good condition relative to the age. So developing communities often will have both a transition study and a reserve study done in conjunction at the same time. Mira, is there anything else I can describe about that?
No, I think that covers it. It was really, I know we sometimes have clients who question the idea of needing to have a reserve study right away. And so I just kind of wanted to touch on the difference there. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And it really is a great idea to get the reserve study done right away so that you can get the dues on track initially right away. And even if you do have to gradually work up to kind of fully fund the reserve account, at least you have a plan. So as you're presenting these initial budgets that are prepared by the association now instead of the developer, you can outline the plan to the homeowners of, we might be underfunded right now, but these are all of the components that we're responsible for. These are the needs of the community. And this is ideally what we need to fund to this account to avoid special assessments. So it is a good idea to do it sooner than later. Otherwise, you end up playing catch up. So a reserve study has two main portions. There's both the physical evaluation and the financial analysis. Again, this is pulled right from CAI's reserve study standards. When we say physical evaluation, that's essentially the site visit where we're coming to the property and evaluating the community. This essentially is determining the association's needs or that 30-year expenditure plan or roadmap of the community. So during the physical evaluation, we are meeting with the community key stakeholders and providing that inspection. So what are we doing during the meeting? That's where we're really aligning on the scope of responsibility. So that initial meeting to discuss what the association is responsible for. We're going to discuss the history of capital projects. So when did you last replace your roof or your carpet or your playground, right? When were these projects last done? What concerns do you have? Are you seeing concerns with any retaining walls or what areas are concern of for you? And then what planned projects do you have? Are you planning on renovating your lobby or modernizing your elevators? Any planned projects that are underway that we should know about and incorporate into the reserve study? And then we're going to lastly review that operating budget. So get an understanding with you of how the association currently is operating and functioning. How much money are you allocating for maintenance? How much are you currently contributing to reserves? What does your overall budget look like currently? We would never recommend changing your budget mid-year. We're always going to incorporate what you're currently contributing, and our recommendations will typically begin the following year. So just to make sure we understand how you're operating in the current fiscal year so that we can incorporate that. To that meeting, after we've all aligned on the kind of scope of work and the association's common elements, then the engineer or reserve specialist is going to perform that inspection. So during the inspection, they're quantifying all the components, right? So measuring the roof or measuring the carpet, measuring the streets, the pool, counting furniture, finding all your split systems or HVAC systems. So really now putting eyes on all of the components and performing that condition in life expectancy. So based on the materials used, how long would we anticipate this component to typically last? And then based on the condition that we see, what's the remaining life? When do we think this project will occur? It's important to know that the condition will govern the replacement timing. So there might be a component, let's just say a roof, that has a 15 to 20 year useful life normally. But you inform us that it's 16 years old and the roof looks in great condition. We're not going to show replacement in 4 years just because it's at the end of its useful life, right? The condition really will govern. So we'd say normal life, 15 to 20 years, 16 years old, good to fair condition. Therefore, we're deferring replacement until X, right? Or it could be the reverse. It could be an 8-year-old roof that's in poor condition. We're not going to give it another 10 years of life because that's a normal life. If it's failing, you're going to need to replace it ahead of time. And so we want the reserve study to be reflective of the true needs. Now, I will say it's not a crystal ball, right? It's not going to be, this is exactly when you need to do this project, and this is going to be the exact cost. It is a budgetary tool. So things might happen a little sooner, a little later. It might be slightly different cost. I always encourage you to call your reserve specialist as these situations are occurring. They can talk through what our recommendation was and discuss with you what's actually happening, just to make sure we're all aligned and on the same page and everyone's comfortable with the projects moving forward. But it is important to remember that it is a budgetary tool. As part of the inspection, we are going to do the best that we can to discover the manner of replacement. So what we mean here is there are often times it does make sense to coordinate projects, right? If you have a bunch of mechanical equipment on your roof and you need to replace your roof, is there an opportunity to coordinate some of this work? Or if you have to do facade work, can we coordinate some balcony work or interior renovations? While we're replacing the carpet, probably a good idea to also paint the walls, or maybe every other cycle, replace the light fixtures so we have a cohesive look. If we are doing repaving work, if you have private streets, that's a good time to also do some curbing or maybe some sidewalk repairs, right? So we will do the best we can to coordinate these projects, but also make sense that what's the most cost-effective way to do it, right? We're not going to prematurely do things just to coordinate if you don't truly need to do it. So we'll work through some of those scenarios to come up with what makes the most logical sense at that time. And then also look for factors that are going to affect the replacement cost. So obviously the size and scope of the work is going to be important, as well as access and mobility. So if you are in downtown DC and it's a really tight area and you need a crane to access some of the mechanical equipment on your roof, obviously a much different price point than if you are in the suburbs of Virginia and you have a clubhouse and you have a split system that's sitting right outside of the building, much easier access, right? So all of those sort of things will play into the replacement cost of the component. So after we've had that inspection or that physical evaluation and we've developed the 30-year roadmap of expenditures, the next step is really that financial analysis. How are we going to pay for it? So reserve study is snapshot in time. You're going to provide us that starting reserve balance. So as of today, how much do you have in reserves? What is your current year budgeted contribution? Like I said, we're not going to recommend changing contributions this year. So what have you budgeted for this year? We've now outlined the expenditures. So the last variable we're solving for is really that recommended future reserve contribution. So it's a pretty simple formula where we're offsetting those expenditures or those needs by how much you have in the bank today, your current balance plus future contributions. There's no right or wrong. We're not going to say, shame on you. You only have 20,000 and you really should have 200,000. There's none of that. Can't go back in time. It's how do we get to where we need to be moving forward? And if you are drastically underfunded, it might be some phased increases, right? Let's try and make this as manageable as possible to get the association back on track. So we've discussed kind of what a reserve study is and how it's prepared, but how do you facilitate the reserve study as a board member? There's some items that we're going to request prior to the meeting. Typically, we would work with management on this. Sometimes board members do want to be the lead, so we'll defer to you as the client on who we should facilitate some of this with. But we're going to want to look at those financial documents ahead of time. So we're going to want to review that financial statement to get our arms around that reserve balance, as well as the operating budget. Like I said, we're happy to take a look at those legal documents, so the declaration and bylaws, see if we can gather kind of common elements from reviewing those. Any planned projects that you have underway, if available, if you're in the middle of a project or you've recently signed a contract for some upcoming work, we would like to take a look at that so that we can discuss it with you during that kickoff meeting. And then lastly, we can utilize your current interest rate for the rate of return on that reserve account. So not something we absolutely have to have. We can use an average as well, knowing that we are covering a 30-year period, right? So you're not going to have that same interest rate throughout the whole duration of the study. So we can use a more kind of normalized average rate. So how do you facilitate those two main portions of the reserve study, both the meeting and the inspection that we mentioned? What should you expect for that? So the meeting will typically last, call it an hour, and it's usually before the inspection. So ideally first thing in the day. It could be as quick as 5 or 10 minutes for a very simple community. Since Virginia requires reserve studies and Maryland now too, there are some communities that just have an entrance monument and they're getting a reserve study, right? That's pretty simple, not a ton to talk about there. We'll align on the financials, align on concerns, any history. And so that meeting might only be 5 minutes. Now, there could be a real large master plan community or a high rise that's older and has a lot of moving pieces. That meeting can go as long as 2 hours, right? It really depends on the complexity, how many moving pieces there are, the level of involvement, and the level of questions, really. This is a great time to bring any questions or concerns that you have to that meeting. As far as who should attend, we really defer to you. So certainly it's a good idea to have management involved. If you are a mid or high rise that has a building engineer, helpful to have the building engineer there because they have a lot of the history typically on some of the mechanical equipment, as well as any community stakeholders. And what we mean there is it could be a board member, like a treasurer, maybe it's the board president, or it might even be a homeowner that just has a lot of history with the community. Maybe the board members are relatively new, maybe management's relatively new and doesn't have a lot of the history with the community. But there's a board member that's been there since the inception or a homeowner that's been there since the inception. Invite them along so that we can all learn together and all get on the same page with some of the history, right? But ultimately, we will defer to you on who should attend. As I mentioned, we welcome any questions or concerns. So if you have a question maybe about your window sealants or something with the pool or the playground, bring any of those questions for us. We are happy to take a look at them and make sure that everyone's comfortable and everything is addressed.
Quickly, I want to just say that EJF strongly encourages board members to participate. I know, I've been managing an association now for 14 years, but I have two board members that have gone on each of their reserve studies and learned something new each time on their walkthroughs. So it is an interesting way for board members to get to know a lot of the mechanicals of the building that you might not know. We also had a quick question about DC, does DC require reserve studies, which I think at this time is no, Michelle, but I wanted to bring it up just in case.
Right, you're absolutely right. DC does not, Virginia and Maryland do. It certainly is a best practice. CAI recommends updating reserve studies every 3 years now. That changed when they revised the standards last year. Virginia and Maryland require them every 5. So this area, as a rule of thumb, kind of does them every 5 years, plus or minus, because that's what's required by law. But best practice is every 3, and DC does not have that requirement though. So it's just a best practice.
And just in case anybody doesn't know, CAI stands for Community Associations Institute. Michelle and I are both very active in it, and so we throw that around like everybody knows what it is, but just an update on that. It is Community Associations Institute, and they are the professional organization that helps govern community associations throughout the country, or actually throughout the world now. Sorry. So anyway, back to you, Michelle.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. You're right. I always just kind of threw it out there. So thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to explain that. So the inspection, as Mira mentioned, it's a really great opportunity to kind of learn your community, see it through a different lens. And similar to how Mira and EJF encourage it, we do as well. It really is nice and makes it much easier on the back end when you receive this reserve study to understand it when you've contributed and been a part of it on the front end. It's honestly really not a huge time investment. We can be really efficient with it. It can be, like I said, as quick as 5-10 minutes, or depending on the level of questions and complexity, it can go longer. But we do everything we can to really align on any questions, align on scope of work, get everything squared away initially, and then free you up on your day, right? So we want that board involvement or community member involvement initially, free you up on your day, and then we'll finish the inspection independently. Now, if it is a mid-rise, high-rise, we'll need a little bit more time from the building engineer or maybe the community manager to get us into any locked spaces on the roof, that sort of thing. But we will do everything we can to minimize your time up front, and then the engineer will work independently on the back end, just making sure that's when we're actually going around and quantifying everything. So counting whether it's light fixtures, inspecting retaining walls and measuring those, you name it. They'll be doing all that quantification and inspection after the fact, after meeting with you. It is helpful to notify residents ahead of time. The engineers are often walking around taking notes, taking pictures to document condition. So residents can get a little concerned, understandably, usually identified with a logo or business card so we can explain what we're doing, but it is usually helpful if they have a heads up that someone will be around the community, kind of checking things out and what we're doing. And we're always happy to help with that. Like there's, little blog articles about what it is, or whether it's just a kind of process overview document. If we can help with any of that communication, we're more than happy to do that. So after that meeting, your time is really freed up unless there's any outstanding information, maybe a project underway that you want to tell us some more information about and you want to kind of gather some documents. That can sometimes happen. But for the most part, after that meeting, you're freed up. And then the engineer is going to go back, crunch the numbers, put everything together, and then you'll typically receive a report within anywhere from a few weeks to a month, usually a month, 6 weeks. It usually doesn't go much longer than that before you receive the report. So when you get the report, it will look different depending on who provides it. That's just kind of the nature of it. I'm a visual person, so I'll kind of explain some of the highlights and what to expect by looking through ours. And I'll kind of speak to what's typically different. But every reserve study will typically have an executive summary, all the high-level detail, that expenditure plan, so that's what's based from that physical evaluation, the funding plan, so ultimately what's the funding recommendation, and then a supportive narrative to kind of explain some of the expenditures. So when we say executive summary, again, all the high level details. So this is usually helpful for, say, resale packets. So you maybe don't have to provide the entire reserve study. You can get away with kind of all the high level detail. Or even for the average homeowner, this is usually enough information for the average homeowner. They can see all of the funding goals. So what is driving our funding, right? What's our biggest expense, or where's kind of our critical year? What projects should we prioritize? We call this kind of a 5-year outlook, and that's mainly because in this area, for the most part, everyone does them every 5 years. So what should we really focus on between now and the next update? Which projects should we prioritize? And then lastly, what's our funding recommendation? How much should we ideally be contributing to reserves? Again, in Virginia and DC, best practice, so this is what you should be following. Maryland, you have to. So if you're located in Maryland, you have to do the reserve study and then you have to fund it. Where in Virginia, you just have to disclose it. You got to do it, you got to disclose it, but you don't, it's board's direction. They can decide if they are going to fund it or not. There was recent legislation that just passed this year that now gives boards the authority to special assess or take out loans for any critical repairs. So historically, they couldn't do that. It had to be kind of vote of membership and that sort of thing, where now, if the documents don't specifically mention that they can't do it, they can do it. So if they don't have the reserve funds available and they need to repave their streets or replace their roofs, the association, the board can now take out a loan on the association's behalf for these critical projects. And that is new legislation. Virginia has had that reserve study law for years and years and years. But in recent years, as we're seeing reserve studies kind of become more commonplace and required in more places, they are reevaluating their laws. So that was a recent change, and I'm told we should expect more to come, but we'll see what comes up in the next legislative session.
And just to make clear what Michelle was saying in terms of funding the reserve study, what she's saying is that in Maryland, you are required to fund to the level recommended by your reserve study. So if you're contributing $10,000 and your reserve study says that you need to contribute $30,000 a year, you have to then, your next budget cycle has to have that $20,000 increase. And that's only in Maryland right now. And then the ability to special assess or take a loan, the legislative change, is that only in Maryland as well? Virginia already had that. I didn't understand that completely.
Yeah, sorry about that. Virginia just passed that. Okay. So Virginia they can do the special assessment, they can do the loans on behalf. They didn't have that before. So that did just pass just last year. And in Maryland, they have to follow it by law. So it's just kind of built in that they have the authority to do it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So again, this executive summary, really great for potential buyers, future buyers, current homeowners, anyone that wants to know kind of generally where the reserves are, but doesn't need to deep dive into the specifics. Now, management and the board certainly should have their arms around the expenditure plan, which this again, it's going to look different depending on who prepares your reserve study, but any expenditure plan will have all of these things where it's going to have a component inventory. Ideally, all of the inventory is quantified. Sometimes studies will have more allowances, but everything should be quantified or measured. Everything will have a useful life, and then everything will have a predicted remaining useful life, meaning a timeline of when we think this project will happen, and then the associated cost. So using this example, there are 1,500 square feet of balconies. The balconies typically have their composite material, so like a wood composite, has a useful life of 20 to 25 years. Based on condition, we anticipated needing to do it in 2025, and they were in a variety of condition, built over a few different years. So it is something we phased. So we showed it over a 3-year phase to start in 2025 and go through 2027. So you can see that total project cost was $157,000, but it was phased over 3 years. And it works out to be slightly more than that because there is inflation incorporated, which is something we do want to do. You want to have everything priced out in today's dollars, but inflation should be applied and taken into account over that 30-year period. So this is ultimately what's going to develop the needs of the community. 30-year period, these are the needs of what we think will need to be done to properly maintain your community. As I mentioned, not a crystal ball. So it might be that they needed to replace the balconies in 2024, or maybe they're still in great condition. We're entering into 2025. We had them evaluated. They're still holding up just fine. We're going to defer that project out to 2026 and reevaluate it to maybe consider starting the project in 2026. Or maybe, you know what, this worked out. They're right. We're entering 2025. We need to start replacing the balconies, but we get a great cost. A construction company comes in and says, you know what, if you do all of them now, you'll get this better cost. You now have the ability to change that, right? You don't have to do it right when it's said. You can move things around with what makes sense for the community. One thing to keep in mind is if you are deferring projects, they don't go away. So this is especially big in Maryland where you're required to fund it. The reserve account, people will think, well, oh, the balance says we needed to have $60,000 and we actually have $90,000. So we don't need to contribute to reserves next year. Well, no, if you have $90,000 because you've deferred or pushed out a $50,000 project, it's not that you have a surplus right now, right? Because you still have this liability or expense that is in the near term that's going to happen, right? So I think that's one thing to keep in mind is as you defer projects, make sure they stay on your radar. It's becoming more commonplace to provide some sort of workable file with the reserve study. So when we were founded 30 years ago, you'd get your 3-ring binder in the mail, and that's how you received your reserve study, right? And as technology has evolved, then we moved to PDF, and now we provide an actual Excel file. So that's intended really to help you keep it current, kind of track actuals, right? So as you're deferring projects, just move it out a year, or as you move projects up, or as maybe the cost changed or inflation changes, you have something to keep it current, to have a workable file, to keep your arms around where the association has gone. Because we know, again, it's not a crystal ball, things will change. So I think that's something to keep in mind and to ask for, just to make sure you're getting some sort of workable file to help you keep it current. Now, based on those expenditure plan, or I'm sorry, yeah, the expenditure plan, now we need to put together the supporting funding plan, right? How is the association going to pay for all of those expenses that were outlined? So it truly is a cash flow, money in, money out. How much money do you have at the beginning when we're first preparing the reserve study? What was your budgeted contributions for this year? What's the anticipated interest you'll earn? What are the planned expenditures to come up with a projected year-end balance that becomes the following year's starting balance, right? So balance, contributions, so money in, interest, money in, expenses, money out, projected year-end balance becomes the following year's starting balance. There's a couple different variations of funding methodologies that those standards, the Community Associations Institute standards that I mentioned, utilize. There's one called the component method, where that essentially is looking at each component or each line item from that expenditure plan as a separate reserve account. It's an ultra conservative methodology. Personally, we don't recommend doing that at Reserve Advisors. We recommend the cash flow. So some providers will provide multiple funding methodologies. They should include the cash flow if that's something to keep in mind and to make sure you look for. But that essentially treats reserves like one big pot of money. So as your needs change, as timing moves, you have that flexibility because it's all put in one place as opposed to tying up these funds and locking them into all these different components. It's not a best practice to have a balcony reserve, a roof reserve, maybe a pavement reserve, right? You want one big reserve account that you can pull from when you need to. So the reserve study is really going to find that critical year. Where are you draining that reserve account? We're going to ensure that you're funded for in that year, and then kind of by default, you're funded for in all of the other years. I'm a really kind of visual person. This is truly a graphic of that funding plan and something that I think makes it much easier to understand the importance of reserves and what they are, right? I always encourage our clients to share this graph, maybe at an annual meeting when they're explaining what reserves are and why they need to contribute to this account, because it helps homeowners understand the true needs of the community. So in this graph, the green bars are those reserve contributions. The red bars are the reserve expenditures. And then that blue line is the reserve balance. So if we say reserves don't exist, we're not going to have this reserve account, the whole top half of the graph goes away. You'd essentially have a really varying budget, right? You'd have years where you have real low expenses, years where you'd have really big expenses, and you'd have these crazy fluctuations in the budget. Really difficult for management to manage, for board members to manage the budget, as well as individual owners to manage their finances, right? Really difficult to predict. And that's really the intent of reserves. And I think a good way of describing it to homeowners is this is a way for us to stabilize the budget. We know inflation is going to happen, costs will increase, and that should be reflected in the reserve too. You can see it's kind of going up in time with an inflationary increase, but this does provide that stability, right? We know there's going to be years, you can see at the beginning here, where we're contributing more than we're spending. We're growing that reserve account. But then just in a few years, there's years where we're spending much more than we're contributing and we're draining that reserve account. And that's great. You want to spend the money. You don't want to have $600,000 in the bank forever. This isn't that kind of cushion account. You want to use the money when you need it. So there will be these fluctuations, but I think this really helps homeowners understand it, because otherwise it's really easy for a homeowner to say, well, why do we have $600,000 in the bank? And you're telling me we still need to contribute to this account. We have insurance going up. We have all these expenses increasing. Can't we just cut the reserve contribution, take a year off from it? And this really helps understand, well, no, even though things look good right now, and it seems like there's not a lot we need to do, if you look in 5 years from now, we're spending all of this money or need to plan to spend all of this money to maintain what we have, right? So we have to keep with it. We can't just decide to forego reserve contributions, because if the funds aren't available, that essentially means we're going to have to special assess, take out a loan, or defer the work, which obviously we don't want to do. That's going to cost more money in the long run. So something like this, I think, is really helpful for the average homeowner to understand kind of what reserves are and why you need them.
Hey, Michelle, quick
Yeah.
one, because I love this question. Even if DC doesn't require a reserve study, do banks and mortgage lender institutions penalize buyers if the association is not following the contributions suggested in the reserve study?
Great question. And I will say more people are looking at the reserve study now. After the Surfside, Florida building collapse a few years ago, there's been a lot more eyes are on reserves, right? Everyone realizes it's a really great tool to help understand the risk that the association, the financial risk of the association. So lenders certainly want to take a look at it, right? Whether it's a lender that the association's working with on a project, maybe you want a loan for an elevator modernization. Well, if they see that you also need to replace your roof, do all this facade work, you need garage repairs, there's some risk for them there, right? Or how are you going to be able to pay them back for this when you also need to fund for all of that? So they're going to want to take overall needs into account as part of that loan. And same thing with personal owners. So if you want to sell your unit, potential buyers, mortgages, their lending companies are going to ask for it too to understand the risk. They want to know what the risk is of this association defaulting, right? Are we giving a loan on a condominium or on a home that's in a pretty stable spot, or is there a lot of deferred maintenance there? Insurance, I'm told insurance companies are looking at it to help understand their risk, right? If there's a reserve study that says you should have replaced your roof 3 years ago and you still haven't, there's some risk there for them, right? It shows that you have deferred maintenance probably, and something that maybe they should probably consider that you might be more susceptible to claims in your insurance, right? So a lot of different industries, including lending, FHA is looking at reserves. They want to see that you have a reserve study that was completed within 3 years. They want to see it and want to understand what sort of deferred maintenance you have. So lenders, insurance, a lot of different eyes are looking at the reserve study, even if they're not legally required.
Right. And I can say, well, I'm not going to say penalize, which is what the question was. In the last week have been asked by a lender for someone who is selling their unit, the potential purchasers, lender did ask me about, can we see the reserve study and what is the reserve funding plan? Luckily, in this case, the association in question is meeting their reserve goals. They are funding to what the reserve study says to fund. But um, looping back to the prior questions, if we've gotten pushed on it, it is DC law does not require it, but some lenders are being pretty attentive to this. So it's a great question to ask. So thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question. And then the last section of the report really is this report narrative section. And this is where I find that reports differ the most. There's a lot of variability because it's not really super tight in the standard what has to be provided for these report narratives. So as you're considering a reserve study, I strongly encourage you to compare sample reports and really take a look at what makes the most sense for you. What is easiest to read, easiest to understand, and that you find the most valuable. This is a section of our report narrative, so everything will be quantified. So when we say the siding and trim need to be painted, well, what does that mean? What is that comprised of? Whoop. And so this is where we're explaining, okay, well, that also includes the wood railings and the columns, but it doesn't include the aluminum soffit and fascia, right? So this is where we're going to explain what's included. This is where we're documenting everything with photographs. So most reserve studies will have photographs, but again, it's going to vary what that format or layout looks like in the inclusion. But it is usually helpful to have photographs. So you have that snapshot in time. This was the condition that the remaining life was based off of, right? This is what it looked like when they were there. And then also a great place to go to understand what that replacement cost entails. So when you see whether it's siding, you're saying we need to paint. Did you include for any partial replacements? What about sealants at the windows or a roof? Is it a total replacement? Is it an overlay? Are we including any decking with the roof, right? What all is included in that project? And of course, if the narrative information isn't there, reach out to your reserve specialists. We want to partner with you. Everyone in the industry wants it to be something that works for you guys and that you have an understanding of what we were thinking at the time the project's done. So it might be 2 years from now when you're tackling one of these projects, you get a contract or a scope of work. Feel free to call that reserve specialist and we can talk through what our recommendations were, take a look at what they're recommending, just to help you kind of compare. Hopefully it's apples to apples, but maybe apples to oranges. If you're seeing difference in price, maybe there's some reasons why, right? So don't just kind of throw the reserve study in the garbage, think, oh, this isn't good for anything. Give the reserve specialist a shot, have a conversation with them, just to at least understand what their recommendations were and why. And then lastly, best practice is really, now that you've had the reserve study, you've read it, ideally are incorporating it into your budget, or at least considering it and developing a path to get reserves on track. But you want to be reviewing it annually, right? So as we're entering into 2024 budget season, you're working on your budget for 2025. Take a look at it. What projects have we deferred that we're supposed to do and we haven't? Let's take a look at those again. Do we need to do them now? What about the projects that were planned for next year? Do we want to do those? Are we going to defer them? Just to get your arms around it and see where you're at with both the planned expenditures, and then also incorporate that into the funding, right? So you can change things around on that expenditure plan and see what that does to the funding requirements. Now, I will say again, you can use it as you see fit in DC and Virginia. In Maryland, still a great idea to keep your arms around it. But if you want to deviate from it, so if you want to change your funding recommendation based on some actuals of what's happened, you do have to go back to the reserve specialist for them to update the reserve study that then you can follow. So that's a good use of that level 3 reserve study that I mentioned. That's more of a non-site or a financial update, where we have a conference call, walk through any changes, rerun the figures, and then you can follow that new funding recommendation.
So we have
And
about 5 minutes left, Michelle. I wanted to just quick plug for, if you have not yet received your budget from EJF, if you have a reserve study on file with EJF, we do include a tab in your budget that has what your reserve study says you should spend in next year. And so look for that. And if you don't see it, it probably means that our budgeting team didn't see that you had a reserve study. So just confirm that with your community manager, because I think that's a very important step. And what Michelle said, it's not a dead document. Like, it's there for you to keep working on it. So, question from the chat is, following up on the Surfside fallout, is there any pushback from the industry on Fannie Mae using reserve study as evidence to deny warrantability for loans?
I think they have a good intention. I believe that the intentions are good. They're trying to ensure that they're only backing loans that are for buildings that are in good condition, right? If they're aware of any defects or construction concerns, structural concerns, they are not lending for those buildings. Now, the problem is the way that's interpreted has varied. We prepare at Reserve Advisors about 4,000 reserve studies a year. And I can tell you there are a handful each year that are interpreted incorrectly. Where, example I can give, it's a DC property, and we saw some water infiltration in a garage. We documented it and said, this isn't a really big concern, monitor it, and we anticipate needing to do structural repairs in 2026. They flagged them and said, we see water infiltration at the garage, like, you're blacklisted. They put them on this list where they're not going to lend to that building. So we worked with the client, they worked directly with Fannie and Freddie to get that revised. We wrote a letter and said, nope, it's fine. There is some minor water infiltration, but it's not an overall structural concern. They're okay to just monitor it and eventually do these repairs out in 2026, right? So come back to your reserve specialist if there are any of those concerns that you have, but they certainly are using them to evaluate risk, and it's just not consistent because they're just such a big body on how they're implementing that, unfortunately.
We had another question. What's the price range on a reserve study? And I know it's kind of highly variable, Michelle, but I think you might be able to mention that. And then just real quick, because we are getting towards the end of our time, if you have a question and you'd like to come off mute, feel free to raise your hand to ask it live. But go ahead, Michelle, with the question on costs.
Yeah, so it will vary. It's really time-based. So it's very small, simple community might be a couple $1,000s, really complicated, big high-rise building or master plan community with a lot of amenities might be more like $10,000. But it certainly is, I would say, from a few thousand to 10,000, it rarely gets, I mean, really, really big could be like 20,000, but it's certainly not going to be 100,000 and it's certainly not going to be $500.
So because I get this question a lot as an association manager, is that a reserve expense, Michelle?
It can be. So some associations want to fund it from the budget. They want to put it in their budget for next year. Some decide they want to do it and didn't have it in the budget. You can absolutely fund it from the reserve account, and we can show it as an expense in the reserve study. So we would just show it right there and be money in, money out.
Okay. So that's a good thing to note, actually, because I never thought of putting it into the next reserve study, that we are going to count that as a reserve item. So,
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see
Honestly, it usually won't really impact because this is such a big thing and the cost of a reserve study is really minor compared to the overall needs of the community. But it certainly can be because it, for some communities, it is a bigger percentage.
I don't see any hands raised. The last little thing I wanted to highlight from a management standpoint, Michelle mentioned it several times. This is a collaborative process. If you get your reserve study back and you disagree with something, I had one several years ago where the board went back and they were like, no, actually, this is not our responsibility. And they were right. And so, I think it was Windows. I can't remember exactly what it was, but you as board members can say, or, we're kind of cool with the way the carpet looks, and you say 10 years, we say 15. Those are things you can talk about with your study person, with the engineer, and you can structure it to your taste. You don't have to just what the engineer says isn't necessarily Bible and gospel, right? You guys, it's a collaborative process with the engineer that you're working with. So
True. I like to call it as like a yes, no, maybe. Like there are some things, carpet, 10 to 15 years, no problem. Happy to do that. No, you say we're never going to replace the roof. Well, we have to disagree with you there, right? We got to keep the roof in there. Maybe might be, hey, we're going to do this repair instead of replace, and it's going to extend the life. Okay, great. Let's talk through that and align and come up with something that everyone's comfortable for. It absolutely should be collaborative. Don't think you have to have everything right in that initial kickoff meeting. All reserve studies will have some sort of revisionary period. Another thing to check, some of them are 30 days, I think 60 days, ours is 6 months. So they will vary, but absolutely use that time to review it, ask questions, have meetings, align, and then ultimately revise the study to something that everyone's comfortable with.
all right. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you, everybody who participated. I really appreciate your time. And we will send out the link to this webinar tomorrow in our weekly updates. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time. And please reach out anytime if we can help.
Thanks.